totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. Great to have you back. I'm Eric Senich. Make sure you subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review if you haven't yet. It's a huge help. And thanks to everybody who's given their 5-star reviews and subscribed to the podcast. It is much appreciated. Our guest this week is Lisa Torem. Lisa is the author of Billy Joel, Every Album, Every Song, which is out now through Sonicbond Publishing. In the beginning, Billy Joel entertained Long Island locals with the Hassles and Attila, prior to forging a solo career in 1971. 1 year later, the singer-songwriter-pianist captivated college students when Captain Jack dominated the Philadelphia airwaves. And so it goes. Cold Spring Harbor was rife with barrelhouse piano and tear-stained balladry, but with Turnstiles, Billy realized his dream of forming a stellar band. The success of The Stranger led to sold-out arenas, and 52nd Street honored the heyday of American jazz, while the Nylon Curtain highlighted socio-economic inequities and wartime brotherhood. 1993's River of Dreams fused reggae and world music. Then, in the early 2000s, Billy's celebration of classical works ushered in a sea change. Unquestionably, Billy's catalog has thrived despite constantly changing trends in the music industry. Over a 50-plus year span, many of his relatable songs have become standards, covered by countless artists. He's the third best-selling solo artist in the U.S., and he's continued to attract multi-generational audiences across the planet. So if you're all in the mood for a melody, pick up a copy of Billy Joel, Every Album, Every Song. As part of Sonicbond's on-track series, Billy Joel, Every Album, Every Song contains behind-the-scenes stories and an analysis of Billy's extensive studio recordings, many of which became top 40 hits in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The book also features a foreword by legendary Billy Joel drummer Liberty DeVitto. Lisa Torem is a rock journalist who's written features, profiles, and reviews for American and British outlets for over a decade. She's interviewed Ian Anderson, Colin Blunstone, Eric Burden, Dave Brubeck, Dave Davies, Janice Ian, Buffy St. Marie, Sarah McLachlan, Robin Trower, Suzanne Vega, Dweezil Zappa, among others. She co-authored Through the Eye of the Tiger with Survivor's Jim Peterick in 2014, and All That Glitters with vocalist Ava Cherry in early 2022. To hear a playlist of Billy Joel, including the music we discuss in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the podcast. It's so great to talk to you.
It's so great to talk to you too, Eric. Thanks for having me.
You've been a Billy Joel fan for quite a while, and you write about how Billy's music was everywhere you were over the course of just a few days. Can you take us back to when you became a fan of Billy Joel?
Well, getting back to the Billy Joel's everywhere, yes, it's true. I did a little social experiment, and after within the span of a day and a half, I went to the local high school. The football players were in a huddle, and then I start hearing some great fills from Liberty DeVitto through this speaker, and then I go shopping, and I hear another Billy Joel tune, and then I go mini golfing, and I'm trying to put the ball into the Eiffel Tower, and I hear We Didn't Start the Fire. So it's like he really is everywhere. It's really hard for me to pinpoint when I became a Billy Joel fan. I did go to a songwriting workshop in which one of the officials from Columbia had brought a demo, and it was of Just the Way You Are. And I was so struck by this demo. It wasn't the best sound quality, but you could hear the wonderful bones of a Billy Joel's tune. It was heartfelt, it was romantic, great harmonies, great chord structures. And I grew up with a piano playing, accordion playing dad who became a high school teacher. And that was always Billy Joel's plan B, to be a high school teacher if he didn't make it in showbiz. So I always felt like he was part of my extended family.
I'm trying to imagine Billy as a high school teacher.
Voracious reader.
Yeah, well, yes. as we can tell with his lyrics, which we'll get to a little bit more. And as you say, he is the definition of eclectic. He can play classical, reggae, jazz, blues, classic rock, new wave, punk. Lyrically, he taps into Shakespeare, Blake Thomas, Frost, war-centered novelists. His songs' main characters, like him, don't come from a place of privilege. You say his family history was riddled with tension and he took some interesting jobs to make ends meet before music. Can you give us a brief background of Billy's childhood and his teenage years?
He was born in the Bronx. When he was about 1.5, his family moved to Hicksville, New York, in an area called Levittown. And that was like a prefab suburban area built after World War II for like returning vets so they can afford a single family home. His parents had met in a Gilbert and Sullivan show in New York. His father, Howard or Helmut, could have been a classical pianist. He was very excellent. He's an excellent pianist, pretty strict on Billy in terms of piano. Billy starts taking piano at 4 and has this amazing DNA right off the bat with the musical and the classical. I mean, there was no way of escaping this DNA. So he started piano lessons at 4. In 1957, his parents divorce. His father moves back to Europe, eventually remarried, starts a new family, and Billy will have a half-brother, Alexander, who, again, Joel DNA, becomes an orchestra conductor in Vienna. They do meet later. But he's raised, meanwhile, in Levittown by the single mother, way before women's lib. It was tough because divorced women were looked at in an askance manner. Sometimes married women would think, stay away from my man and this kind of stuff. It was hard for her to make a living. And I think Billy became sort of the man of the family and also his cousin Judy ends up living with them because his maternal aunt died. So he's not an only child after this. And also there was anti-Semitism. It was a Jewish family. His mother actually had been baptized. But I think some of these things led to a bit of an outsider mentality. Also, so he had piano lessons in the same studio where he took piano lessons. There was a ballet studio, which unfortunately meant he got bullied by some of the neighborhood boys. His mother sent him to boxing lessons. He got pretty good as a featherweight and broke his nose, which he thought was sort of cool.
Yeah, he was a tough dude. He could handle himself on the streets.
He can handle himself. In high school, he starts gigging with a band it goes through a few names, the Echoes, the Lost Souls, the Commandos. He's starting to play out nights, trying to stay up. He's trying to wake up in the morning at Hicksville High, which is no easy task. He would eventually quit school or get kicked out of school very close to the end. And his mother would be, of course, disappointed. Billy, I thought you'd go to Columbia University. And no, Mom, I want to go to Columbia Records. I want to be signed by the Columbia record label.
Yeah.
He was very influenced he saw James Brown at the Apollo. Of course, he's one of those guys who saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. It changed his life. He loved soul. He loved R&B. He loved Jimi Hendrix. He even would write a song called Shameless based on Jimi Hendrix, which oddly enough would become a great country hit.
Shameless and that's one of his last hits. You're right. Yeah, Garth Brooks had a hit with it a couple years after Billy. Billy had a hit with it in 89. That's off of his Stormfront album from 1989. This is fascinating, Lisa. Billy has an extraordinary condition called synesthesia. Did I pronounce that right? Synesthesia.
I hope so. It's a tough one.
Yeah. What is this condition, and what did Billy have to say about it?
Well, it's a condition in which one sense comes across as another sense, and there's different manifestations. In some cases, a person who has this condition can hear something, the name of a city, for example, and then see a bright color like orange, or a person can get a visual stimulus, see a name or a sign, and taste something sweet. So it really has to do with how the senses are triggered. In Joel's case, his condition includes a sensitivity to sound, to color. Colors are triggered when notes or keys are played, but also he has a sensitivity to the grapheme form. So letters, numbers, symbols, they can also trigger colors. And depending on whether it's a consonant or a vowel, that can trigger a different shade, different hue. Now, Billy has said that I think that he thinks of it as a blessing. And I think with any condition, you may find somebody who says, I'm overwhelmed by this. But he doesn't like to talk it up or down too much because I think he really does consider it something special. And just as a little side note, Franz Liszt, Rimsky-Korsakov had this condition. Duke Ellington had this condition. Lord Billie Eilish, Tori Amos have this condition. Itzhak Perlman. So it's much more common than we may think.
He's in good company there. That's a good
indeed.
group. Yeah. Interesting statement you included in the introduction. Covers got Billy into the studio. His originals kept him captive. What did you mean by that? Can you expand on that?
So around 1963, Billy Joel was around 14. And there was a Long Island producer named George Shadow Morton. They called him Shadow Morton. He's a little strange guy. He'd wear capes and he would say things like, "Give me more purple." He'd say these things in the studio, and a young Billy would go in there and he'd, tap the musicians on the shoulder. "What does that mean?" They go, "Just play, kid. Just play, kid." So Shadow had a friend named Ellie who also grew up in the Levittown area where Billy grew up. Ellie Greenwich and her husband Jeff Berry became top songwriters. And Shadow, on a dare, he says, "I'm going to bring you guys some hits." So he's writing for a group called the Shangri-Las, a female quartet. He was known for doing nuances like Leader of the Pack. He would have motorcycle sounds. Remember Walking in the Sand, he'd have seagull sounds. So he knows about Billy Joel. He asks him to come into this little basement for a session. It was a little unclear whether Billy got credit, got paid, but he did do work for Shadow. And so that is what got him in. It gave him that experience, even though he wasn't really mentored terribly well. And by the way, Shadow also worked with Janisine and Vanilla Fudge, Iron Butterfly. So he was pretty well known.
And Billy does get a couple of record deals early on, the Hassles and Attila. What were those bands like sound-wise?
The Hassles would be considered like a blue-eyed soul band. You get a lot of that jangly guitar and a lot of harmonies. They were really modeled after the Rascals, who are also from that area. They did 2 albums together. And so what happened was the Hassles were a very popular group, and they needed a new organ player because their guy, Harry Weber, and we'll be hearing more about the Weber family. It's a big family, and Billy ends up marrying one of the Webers, and we'll get to that later. But the manager was really keen on getting Billy into the band because Harry Weber was a substance abuser and things were not working out too well. And plus, Billy was developing a reputation as being sort of a cool cat. So Billy negotiated and said he would bring his bassist in if they let him in the band. The manager said, "We're going to get you a nice new instrument." Well, it didn't mean he could keep it, but they gave him a sparkling instrument to play. They released 2 albums. Billy started out as the organ player. Little by little, he moved up to be lead singer. And I interviewed Elliot Murphy, who also came up to the Long Island scene, who was still a good friend of Billy Joel's. He remembers driving through a snowstorm to see Billy. And even though when he first saw him, Billy was in the background, he really could sense that Billy was going to move up very quickly in show business. He just had the sound. So anyway, they did some covers, like they did You Got Me Hummin', which is a Sam and Dave cover. They also did originals, like Every Step I Take was a fun one, kind of romantic ballad. And they really got pretty popular, but then they fizzled out. Now then comes Attila, and Billy says to the drummer, "Let's just do a duo." Now this is when Psychedelia was coming in. It was really popular. So now they've got this duo with Billy Joel and John Small, the drummer. He's a real hard-hitting drummer. It's kind of not the Billy Joel we later see. It's kind of gimmicky. On an album cover, they're wearing Attila the Hun outfits. Billy's screaming, doing these histrionics. It's really loud. He's playing bass lines on the organ. John Small's thrashing away. They did an album. It did not do well commercially. And the icing, not on the cake, was that Billy Joel goes and falls in love with his best friend, John Small's wife.
Whoops.
Whoops is right.
Billy, what are you doing, Billy?
Billy, what's going on, man? They produced an album in 1970 with, it's kind of this gimmicky concept thing. It's like the titles like Brain Invasion, Amplifier Fire, which ran over 7 minutes. Billy did get a chance to co-produce with his then manager. But, the whole thing, when you listen to it, it's kind of like a lot of unwieldy guitar work. And if you listen to something called Wonder Woman, Billy sounds like he's kind of doing a Robert Plant thing. His voice sounds really shrill. He's really not paying great attention to dynamics. It's like all on super loud.
Would you consider it heavy metal? It's kind of heavy metal. It's right. The album cover certainly looked heavy metal.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And like, it's a far cry from the Billy Joel we would later see.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I think it's sort of like when you're a teenager, and I think it's kind of healthy to be a rebellious teenager, so maybe you get along with your parents later. So I kind of think it's a growing pain thing, and you had to go through it, and that's how we became the Billy Joel that we would know later. I call it babble without a cause.
You know what? Did you ever read the review by Stephen Thomas Erlewine from AllMusic, that album, Attila?
I probably did. Which one was that?
It says, Attila undoubtedly is the worst album released in the history of rock and roll. Hell, the history of recorded music itself. There have been many bad ideas in rock, but none match the colossal stupidity of Attila. Wow, Stephen. Holy cow.
Well,
Yeah.
he did have some bitter critics. And I did want to at some point address that.
Yeah.
Sometimes those critics really went for the jugular. Sometimes they really went after his personality, which I thought was, what? Why do you have to do that?
Yeah.
But
What did you think? I've never listened to the whole album.
I guess he's just trying to be all these other people. He's trying to be a Robert Plant, and he's trying to jam in all these guitar solos, and maybe he's trying to show off that he can do a cool line. But it's more of a cacophony. It's not. It's almost comical. It's weirdly entertaining.
Yeah, I mean, he's
but
just
it's nothing.
trying to find his voice at that point. He's trying to find and he was also insecure. He didn't believe in himself that much. At least his voice, as we'll find out, right? He was not.
He didn't. And and we'll talk about Phil Ramone later, but Phil Ramone would have to chide Billy because he had such a good ear. He was such a mimic, and he could imitate Joe Cocker, and he could imitate Ray Charles, and he could imitate all these folks. And one time Phil Ramone says, Billy, just be yourself right now. And it was difficult, because I think it was a little bit of insecurity.
Yeah.
But it also meant he was this incredible natural mimic.
As for his solo career, it does get off to a start faster than he expected. Literally, his debut album from 1971, Cold Spring Harbor, was mastered incorrectly. What happened?
To backtrack just a little bit, Billy was really depressed, really anxious to get signed. He does get signed by an LA producer, and his manager has said, I know you're desperate to get signed, give me this deadline. And pretty much on the day of that deadline, he does get Billy signed. But what happens is the production team is transferring the album to vinyl at the wrong speed. So as a result, his voice sounds tinny and thin. And Billy Joel described it as being similar to Alvin and the Chipmunks. And for those perhaps who haven't heard of that, or UK folks, that was a cartoon. It was about this guy who's a manager with these squeaky little chipmunks.
It's not a good thing to sound like when you're getting your career off to a start, your rock career.
That's not a good way to start your rock career. It was redone in the early 80s, but, there were a lot of cuts at that point. There were a lot of edits. There were a lot of instrumental cuts. Denny Sewell was on that original album, who was a drummer with Wings. There was this guy, Sneaky Pete, who was a pedal steel player. He got cut out. A lot of changes, but Billy still wasn't crazy about what they did with his vocals. I don't think they ever really made up for it. But some of the songs did
well,
still,
like She's Got Away. She's Got Away is one of those songs.
Exactly.
That would later become a hit when it was released as a single from his 1981 live album, Songs in the Attic.
Absolutely.
But overall, what is your opinion of Cold Spring Harbor?
Well, it is very eclectic. Tomorrow Is Today was written when Billy was at a low point in his life. You can kind of feel the grief. You can feel the honesty. There's a beautiful little piece called Nocturne. And I'm thinking, it's a beautiful thing. Like, it's so short. Like, why is it so short? Everybody Loves You Now is a very upbeat, rollicking piano piece. The lyrics are about a woman who turns her back on everybody. It reminded me a little bit of like a Harry Nilsson or Harry Chapin kind of tune. And it had a little bit of that cynicism, that bitterness that he would become known for in a good way. Because he was not like a sugar-coated kind of guy. I think he was a very honest songwriter then and honest songwriter till the end of time until now. I interviewed Reese Clark, who was one of his original drummers, and he toured with him. He had a lot of vitality in that album. And as I said, they cut out a lot of the pedal steel. There was quite a bit of pedal steel. But I enjoyed his use of lyrical repetition. He had like a restrained vocal performance. And, some of the songs would have lent themselves to good jams if they'd allowed for more time. He referenced his first wife, Elizabeth Weber, in a song called Eliza. And of course, like you said, She's Got Away, which was really surprisingly short, under 3 minutes. And You Can Make Me Free, that got edited out. 5 minutes got edited out of that.
But Billy rebounds and he comes back with the album that would be his breakthrough album, Piano Man, released November 9th, 1973. Now, this is the one that gets him onto the charts, number 98 on Billboard, thanks to the title track, which reached number 25 in the U.S. Some thought the song was about Harry Chapin, but Billy says it wasn't. He's just filling in the characters as he writes the song, and you write that it's the dichotomy that makes Piano Man a classic.
Well, on the surface, it's kind of a light, dreamy song about people coming together in this watering hole. It's bright. It's so easy to sing along with. Of course, I saw him at Madison Square Garden in November. He doesn't have to do a thing. He stands there, gestures, the audience sings the song. Doesn't have to do anything. The chords it's a great chord structure. But so in one sense, it's sort of happy and bouncy. And yet it really is a character sketch about certain people that he meets, that he observes in a very humane way. And they're unhinged and they're stuck and they're desperate and they're lonely. Their dreams have not been realized. They love this watering hole that they're in, but they need an oasis. And it's just a really beautiful song. It's sort of novelistic, cinematic in such a short piece. And it really gives us a little bit of everything.
A few other future Billy Joel classics in this one, too. The Ballad of Billy the Kid and Captain Jack, which benefited from one particular disc jockey in Philadelphia, right?
Absolutely. All these artists, when we look at their careers, would have a believer. In 1954, Dewey Phillips broadcast That's All Right, Mama. We know what happened with Elvis, of course. And I just want to say real quickly, there was a song called Traveling Prayer that was the opening song.
Love
Billy's
that
like
song.
this mile a minute, wonderful barker.
Love that song,
And
yeah.
I love that song. And Dolly Parton, you've got to check out the cover. She makes
really?
her own.
Okay.
Yeah, she just makes that a great tune.
What a bass line. Doom, 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 doom.
Yeah, really? Yeah, totally. So Billy gets this opportunity to perform on a radio broadcast on WMMR at Sigma Sound Studios. Later, so much history in that. We hear about Young Americans and Bowie and the whole business. So this is in April of 1972 in Philadelphia. Eschiaki was a special guy. If he believed in an artist, he also did the same with Bruce Springsteen, who was on Columbia. He gave a lot of airtime, and he had these really intelligent questions, such as you're giving me, Eric, thank you, in his broadcast. And so there were a number of songs. Captain Jack, the older generation, of course, had issues with it. They thought, oh, here's Billy Joel telling all our kids to go on drugs. Well, truthfully, Billy Joel is saying, I'm in the suburb. These kids, like, what the heck's wrong with them? This guy's a loser. I'm watching him from my window. He's selling drugs. What's going on here? I mean, it was really, if anything, an anti-drug song. But the college kids went crazy over it. And this created a buzz. And so that really ended up, I believe that's what got him signed to Columbia Records. He got a contract in 1973.
Man, that's old school. Those are the days of radio. Radio could break an artist. They could
totally
break an artist. If a disc jockey took to a certain artist, they could do it. Billy Joel, every album, every song. It's out now through Sonicbond Publishing, and we're talking with author Lisa Torem. Billy releases Street Life Serenade in 1974. He's looking a little unhappy on the back cover for a reason. I love that you put this in the book. You wrote that he had his wisdom teeth extracted several days earlier.
Ouch.
Yeah. The highlight is the sole single release from the album, The Entertainer, and it features the Moog synthesizer, which is a factor that made this album stand out. But you say not everybody embraced how much he used it on this album.
Well, the Moog synthesizer is such a brash instrument. I think it's kind of a love-hate thing. It's sort of, I have a friend in Scotland, and I'm like, don't you like bagpipes? He's like, no, not really. I love bagpipes. But I think maybe the Moog synthesizer is the American equivalent. I was surprised to find that in the 1930s, there was an English singer named Vera Lynn who they had Moog synthesizer in her work. And of course, we've heard it in American music. And this German musicologist in 1954, he called this sound, it reminded him of barking hellhounds. So there are a lot of detractors for this sound, and it really is very heavily, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of move synthesizer in the entertainer. But it also reminded me of how vulnerable musicians can be during certain changes in the world. In the 40s, there was a musician strike because radio was recording artists. The big bands were thinking, oh my God, nobody's going to come see us. And it just started me thinking about the talkies. When the silent film stars are like, okay, they're going to get rid of all of us now. So I think there was a little bit of that factor as well. Like, okay, we like Billy Joel, the piano player, and the organist, and that's cool. We can handle that. But like, okay, what's happening with this newfangled instrument?
Yeah, and it was more of an English instrument from what I recall. Like Emerson, Lake and Palmer would use it.
Yes.
And Deep Purple, and I'm thinking Uriah Heep. So I thought it was cool that he did it. I wonder where he got that inspiration to try it. Maybe somebody introduced it to him, but I love the way it sounds on The Entertainer. It is perfect on that track.
It is, and he was, in my research, I found he was a big prog rock guy.
He was, okay.
So he enjoyed a lot of these instrumentals from the prog rock groups.
Well, so he must have been listening to those artists, listening to those songs on the radio. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just wanted to add that there were some special numbers in there as well. Root Beer Rag is an instrumental that's about 3 minutes, and it was inspired by Scott Joplin, the big ragtime king. And by the way, that whole ragtime era ushered in jazz. And I just love what Billy did with that song. It's a fascinating arrangement. There's a song called Last of the Big Time Spenders, which is sort of a Leon Russell-y kind of arrangement. And it's a beautiful little song called Souvenir, which he would use as a concert closer, only about 2 minutes, but very lovely melody.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The Booked on Rock podcast is online at bookedonrock.com. Find a list of all the major platforms where you can listen and subscribe to the podcast. Link up to our social media sites. Find out the latest Books on Rock releases. Find your nearest bookstore. And if you want to reach out to us, you can contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com. In May of 1976, Billy releases Turnstiles. This, by the way, the first album that featured drummer Liberty DeVitto, who wrote the foreword to your book, and he offered up some great stories regarding Billy's career. So up until this point, Billy had studio musicians for recording, different musicians on the road, but he wanted to find a permanent band to record and tour with. And Liberty told you about how the Billy Joel band was born. What did he tell you about that?
So there was a bass player named Doug Stegmeyer, and Billy was touring with him as part of the LA entourage. And Billy, he wasn't so crazy about the whole palm tree, sitting under the palm tree, drinking a Mai Tai thing. He was not, he was a staunch New Yorker. He's still a staunch New Yorker. He wanted to get home, and New York was in trouble anyway. But he says to Doug, I want my own band. I would love you to be in a band if we can get this together. I want to go back to New York. I need an aggressive style drummer. Well, Liberty DeVitto was another Long Island guy. Billy Joel and Liberty knew each other. They worked in the same club scene. And Liberty DeVitto had put in his 10,000 hours. He had worked with Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels. He'd worked with a lot of older musicians who would do the whole wedding, bar mitzvah circuit. So he just learned a ton from these guys. He's a very seasoned musician. So now the three of them start doing the tracks for Turnstiles, but they're not done yet. And Billy's like, well, hey, how about guitar players? Do you know any guitar players? Just so happens, he suggests the guitar players. Now, he's getting this because there's already this established band called Topper. And all these guys were in Topper. So little by little, Topper becomes a Billy Joel band. And of course, this is a great gift, I think, for Billy Joel, because these guys had worked together. They had this mental telepathy. It's sort of like, instant rice, just add Billy. They had this groove together. And then Billy works with them, and he didn't have to talk to each session musician. Prior to that, there were some great session musicians, but I think they all came with their own bag of tricks, their own agenda. Now he was in a situation where he could work and they could work on their vision. So his dream was coming to fruition. By the way, so it was Howard Emerson and Russell Javors who were also from Tucker. So they were the guitarists that came in.
Okay. This is when things start to take off for him too, and you get the top 20 singles, "Say Goodbye to Hollywood," along with "New York State of Mind," a Billy Joel classic. Can you talk about the sax solo on "New York State of Mind"? Who is it we're hearing on that, and how does he end up on the record?
So what happened was Doug, the bass player, he had a brother named Al who was a recording engineer. Al had Richie Cannata in his studio, a jazz saxophonist. He knew the band was looking for a saxophone player, so a few of the guys got together. They heard Richie. They said, "Wow, this guy's great." They invite him to the studio. When Richie walks in, the band is doing some stuff that's like not Richie Cannata style, and Richie's like, I don't know. But then when they give him the song that they wanted to solo on, it's just perfect. It's just seamless. And of course, we know that it becomes iconic. Richie ends up leaving the band in 1981. He opens his own recording studio. But then again in the 2000s, he reconvenes. He worked with Billy Joel in Madison Square Garden. They're still buddies and they still work together. And they're still with the Lords of 52nd Street Band, which is the band that Liberty and these guys are in now.
And "Angry Young Man" is also on this album, another great track. But my personal favorite from this album is "Miami 2017, Seen the Lights Go Out on Broadway." What is this song about?
Well, this is an apocalyptic kind of thing. A lot of New Yorkers would retire and move to Miami, so that's where that comes from. And like I said, New York was in bad shape, and this song was really written from the standpoint of a grandparent trying to tell the grandchild, look what happened to New York. Look how it got destroyed. It's just packed with imagery. It's a real solid rock sound. Billy's voice just kills it. And I have to say it's one of my favorites as well.
Hard to believe we are now past 2017, because I remember first hearing that song. We'll never see 2017.
I know, right?
No, we're 5 years past it. Late September of 1977, Billy releases "The Stranger." With Turnstiles not a commercial success, surprisingly, Billy had quite a bit of pressure to come up with a hit. In fact, Columbia threatened to drop him if the next album isn't a success, and he comes through with a #2 album in the U.S. This includes the top 10, "Just the Way You Are," the top 20, "Moving Out," and the top 20 single, "She's Always a Woman." We also have "Vienna," "The Stranger," "Scenes from an Italian Restaurant," and "Only the Good Die Young" on this album. It's like a best of. What do you credit the success of this album to? Is it because he's now got that steady band?
Well, it's certainly a huge part of it. But what happened is we look through the production history of the Billy Joel albums, where Billy sometimes makes decisions he didn't want to and so forth. Well, he approaches George Martin initially, who, for people who don't know, was the big Beatles producer, a very creative producer. But George Martin says, "Billy Joel, you're great, but I would get my own guys in there." So Billy Joel has to make the decision. I believe he made the right decision. So meanwhile, Phil Ramone is a Juilliard-trained musician, so he's got the classical down, but he loves rock. He had worked with Paul Simon. He had been to a concert and with his wife, and his wife said, "You have to check out this warm-up band." And he goes and he sees Billy with the band, and he thinks they're fantastic. So they get together. They're both New Yorkers. They both have a similar sense of humor. Phil Ramone really understands Billy. He sees what an intelligent man he is. Because Billy, in my estimation, seems to be sort of a humble guy. I don't think he's a show-offy guy. He just understands his background. He understands who he is. He understands his sense of humor. So Billy Joel hires him. They had great chemistry. And they have this great lineup. The thing about Phil Ramone is, I believe he had a very high emotional IQ. He would do things like he would put takeout containers on the table, and he'd treat the guys like they were family. "Okay, guys, I know you're hungry. It's almost time for dinner. We got to do a few more takes." He would travel with the band, put in extra hours. He wanted to know all about them. They did the album in record time. I think it was like a little bit over a month. He had these great ideas. One of the stories I loved about Phil Ramone, when you think about some of the producers like the Phil Spector Wall of Sound, that kind of thing, Phil Ramone was in a different category. Billy came up to him and started whistling this haunting tune. And he says, "Well, what do I do with it?" He's thinking, what kind of instrument should I use? And Phil Ramone goes, he's just got to whistle that too. Just keep the whistle. And that turned out to be that haunting introduction to the stranger, which we hear, it's like a sandwich. We hear it at the beginning, we hear it at the end as a reprise. And I thought that was part of his genius. It wasn't always the crazy wall of sound. Sometimes it was the thing right in front of him.
Just the Way You Are was about to be shelved, but a couple of people influenced Billy and the band to include it.
Well, Phoebe Snow and Linda Ronstadt, great singers, but they were also very particular about the songs they did. By the way, Peter Asher was Linda Ronstadt's manager, and he will work years later on those some of the collections, Billy Joel collections, with Joe Nicolo, producer. So it all goes around and comes around. So they were in the studio, Linda Ronstadt and Phoebe Snow, and they hear this song, and Billy's like, it's just another love ballad. Who cares? The band wasn't terribly into it. And they're like, no, we love it. It's such a romantic ballad. You've got to keep it in. And that is really why he kept it in. They urged Billy to keep it on the album.
I love that. He's such a humble guy that I think you need somebody there to say, hey, man, put that song on. Because he's going to be like, nah, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, well, this guy's been playing, so from the time he was a kid, and songwriting is easy and not easy. But, I think he kind of needed that third eye. And then Phil Woods is the jazz saxophonist who does that solo.
Okay. And then the sixth studio album is the jazz-influenced 52nd Street. This is released on October 11th, 1978. The cover shows Billy leaning against a brick wall. He's gripping a trumpet against his chest. And there was a rumor regarding that trumpet.
Well, Freddie Hubbard was an acclaimed instrumentalist. He was flown in for the session. And people think it's got to be Freddie's trumpet. But no, it was not. Phil Ramone had the studio, people going in and out all the time. So it was really just laying around. I wanted to say, by the way, that Freddie did the Zanzibar solo.
Oh,
and that took on a whole new youthful audience because of TikTok.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Also on that album, I think if we backtrack a little bit, there's a little bit of that feeling, maybe the little chip on the shoulder thing of, do people really accept us? Are there people that look up or down at us? So I think we have a little bit of that big shot thing, again, that character of somebody who's not really with us. They think they're better than us. And there was also My Life and Honesty. So this songwriting is just getting richer and richer.
That Zanzibar TikTok reference, just for those who may not know, there's a TikTok dance challenge, right, to Billy Joel's Zanzibar.
Yeah. And it's funny because I talked to, what is it, like an 18-year-old in my neighborhood. For some reason, we started talking about Billy Joel, and he's like, oh, yeah, I heard about Zanzibar. How'd you hear about Zanzibar? It's TikTok.
Man.
Yeah.
Hey, whatever it takes to get it to the younger audience, that's fine, man. They get to hear some Billy Joel.
That's right. Keep it alive.
Say to him, that's just one song. There's plenty more where that came from. Yeah.
Zanzibar is a fun tune. Phil Ramone thought that Billy was talking about a bar. They had a little miscommunication. Billy's thinking of the country and Phil Ramone's thinking about the bar. So like they were brainstorming, and the song just went through these different iterations. But it's just such a classy tune.
By the way, do you have a favorite album cover? That first one, the Piano Man album cover. That one, he's got those piercing eyes looking right at you, that black and white photo. But I don't know which one would be my favorite. Which one is your favorite?
Well, how strict are you on which one is my favorite? Can I toss a few to you?
Go ahead. There are no rules. There are no rules.
Okay. Well, there are such interesting covers. I kind of had this thing about an Innocent Man cover, for one thing, because it's very definitive of the era. This is where he's doing his kind of 50s tribute, etc. He's got that hairstyle. He's got his leather, straight leg pants, the black boots. It's a flattering shot, but it's a little mysterious. He's gazing outwards. He's on this metal stairwell in Soho, which is a pretty trendy area now. I'm not sure what it was like back in the day. And there's a little bit of mystery to it. And I'm thinking, why is he sitting there? I've been to New York a bunch of times. If I walk past that street, it gave me a little feel of like Abbey Road, like that place feel. where you want to get on that zebra crossing and say you were cool because you're on the zebra crossing. I wanted to kind of sit on that stairwell, but it was a bit of a mystery. They didn't tell me that until I looked at the credits and so forth. Also, Turnstiles was really interesting. It was an interesting cover. The characters on the cover were illustrative of the content of the record. It reminded me a little bit of Sgt. Pepper, even though Sgt. Pepper, there wasn't that one-to-one correspondence at all. But you could look at the album and it was fun. It was like a game. Okay, why is there a girl with headphones?
There's a reason why all those people are there and where they're placed. Is that
right? One is a grandparent. There's a girl with headphones. There's a couple dancing, and the little boy by the turnstile was his first wife's son. So there's a story, and it's just fun to go, hey, what's that? Why is that person? Why is that animated person there? And that was at the Astor Place subway. So that was a photograph by a photographer named Jerry Abramowitz, who would do sort of these very bold cover shots of celebrities. There's always something, whatever he did seemed to be very bold. And then the River of Dreams album, which won a Grammy, was by Christy Brinkley, who was Billy Joel's second wife, supermodel and artist. And it's this beautiful swirl of color, curious imagery. There's a lot to unpack on there. It's real eye candy. There's like these wild animals and boats and skyline and volcanoes and lush foliage and this big dreamy picture of Billy Joel with his eyes closed. And that's also illustrative of the contents. But this is a very eye candy-ish cover.
I think I have my favorite, and it's actually one that you didn't mention, and we'll get to that one very soon, because it's actually the album that comes after 52nd Street. Little clue there. But back to 52nd Street. This is the first of 4 Billy Joel albums to hit number 1. He wins 2 Grammys, including Album of the Year, 3 top 40 singles, My Life number 3, Big Shot number 14, and Honesty number 24. As for My Life, Phil Ramone wanted a straight disco beat. Liberty DeVitto wasn't happy about that?
Well, you got to look at Liberty DeVitto. Here's a guy who comes to the studio with just tons of street knowledge, self-taught musician, real hardworking, really talented. I think the word disco might have been the death knell to a lot of drummers, right? And in Chicago, and we had a famous disco demolition where some DJs just like destroyed all these disco records.
At Comiskey Park. Right? Comiskey Park.
Exactly. So, sure, disco was fun to dance to. I love disco. But I think for Liberty, who was such an innovator, he's like, wait a minute, that doesn't require a lot of imagination. I'm just speculating what he's thinking, really. And he was a very instinctual player. And I'm thinking that he's thinking this is some kind of cheap commercial gimmick. Like, why would Bill Ramone want me to do this? Why is he telling me to do this? I'm an independent drummer. So no, they did not agree on this drum part of the arrangement. But Bill Ramone was very adamant. This is what we have to do. It's my vision of the song. Liberty ultimately was really happy. I mean, he really liked Phil. They really got along for the most part. And the song became a gold record. At that point, he's like, Phil, that was a great idea.
Yeah. Hey, you're onto something. Well, think about it. Pink Floyd, The Wall.
Yes.
Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2. Bob Ezrin, the producer, says, let's have a disco beat on that. And, of course, Pink Floyd, Roger Waters, like, are you insane? And he talked him into it. But, yeah, that was, at the time, these bands were doing it. Some bands were going all out disco, like Kiss, I Was Made for Loving You. Or like the Stones were kind of mixing it in a little bit. Miss You is disco, but it's still the Stones. So not surprising. And that was what was going to get people out on the dance floor. So why not? As long as you're not losing your sound altogether. But I guess that's debatable, some would say. But that track, you're not thinking disco. It's a disco beat, but it's not a disco song, So
True.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Don't miss an episode of the Booked on Rock podcast. Subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, or just go to the Booked on Rock website, bookedonrock.com, to find a full listing of podcast platforms where you can subscribe and follow. That's bookedonrock.com. Let's get to my favorite album cover. That is Glass Houses. I think that might be my favorite because you're looking at him. He's ready to smash that thing to pieces. Where is that taken, by the way? Where's that photo?
It's actually at one of his homes.
At one of his homes?
Yes.
Wow. Because it looks like it's somewhere in the city, like a park. Interesting. And here's another huge hit album, Glass Houses, released on March 12th, 1980. Number 1 in the U.S., another Grammy win. It sells over 7 million copies in the U.S. alone. And it includes the number 7 single, You May Be Right. Number 19, Don't Ask Me Why. Number 36, Sometimes a Fantasy, one of my all-time favorite Billy songs. And Billy's very first number 1 single, It's Still Rock and Roll to Me, which includes the lyric, how about a pair of pink sidewinders and a bright orange pair of pants? What, Lisa, are pink sidewinders? What the hell are those?
I feel such vintage fashion pressure right now. I am not a fashionista, just a Midwestern girl, but the jury is still out on that, Eric. I asked Liberty, and he didn't know for sure. He thought maybe they were like vintage shoes or socks. Now, some fans have gone so far as to say that it refers to the way shoes are laced, that it's a little more intricate than that. We can only surmise that it is something to do with I'm guessing, 50s fashion. And I looked in an Urban Dictionary, and that definition was sort of a cranky, craggy old person, which I don't think would have much to do with this.
Yeah, and Billy's never been asked, or he has and doesn't want us to know?
No, I don't. It's one of those, like, what did Billy Joe McAllister throw off the Tallahatchie Bridge kind of things, or like who's so vain about, one of those dark rock and roll secrets maybe.
Yeah.
You'll get it out of somebody, I'm sure.
Eventually. Author Lisa Torem is our guest to talk about her new book, Billy Joel, Every Album, Every Song, which is out now. So now we get to September of 1982, September 23rd of 82. Billy's album, The Nylon Curtain, is released, a number 7 album. And it's one of the first albums to be digitally recorded, mixed, and mastered. And producer Phil Ramone really had some fun with effects on this album. Can you talk about some of the new equipment he brought in for this album? It's like he had a whole set of new toys to play with.
Right. Well, Phil Ramone wrote a great biography, so you can find out more about that. You can look at my bibliography for that. So don't ask me to explain all this technically, but he had a control box with echoplexers, MXR phases, and flangers. Now, he didn't want Billy to have the burden of having to be a technician. He knew Billy wanted to do his arrangements, singing, And so what he did is he labeled the box with easy to remember buzzwords like Elvis, so that Billy would get a sense of what the effect was, but he wouldn't have to deal with all the technology. He could just simply press on one of the buzzwords. And in doing this, Billy had access to sort of this toy, and he had creative control over the arrangement to the best of his ability.
And you hear those effects throughout the album and on the singles, which were the number 20 single, Pressure, the number 17 single, Allentown, and his classic about the Vietnam War, Goodnight Saigon, which reached number 56. Can you talk about the Eastern European folk dance element of the song Pressure? What Liberty told you about the track and the group of nearby Russians who contributed to that track?
Right, so Synchronicity. So what happened is the guys would always get a demo tape of a song, and they had it in the car, they're driving around, and Russell Javors starts singing it, and he's like, that sounds like a plastic dance, which is like some of the individuals in Russia, and it did. It's the first time it struck me. It's like, yeah, this does sound like. I didn't think of it as like a folk music dance.
No,
but when I heard it, I'm like, okay, I get that. It's a very odd rhythm for one thing, and then coincidentally, there was a group of Russians, and who would usually go to like the Orthodox Church to perform or something. They didn't know much about Billy Joel. They're carrying these balalaikas, and they got ushered into the studio, and I'm not sure they even knew what hit them, but we got some more flavors in this song.
Yeah, another one of my all-time Billy favorites, along with Goodnight Saigon, which this brought some to tears in the studio. Billy didn't serve in Vietnam, but he did have some close friends who did, and they were the ones who asked him to write a song about it. And he said they drank beer and bared their souls. And this is a testament to Billy as a songwriter, his ability to convey their story so powerfully. Liberty, again, shares another great story, this regarding the reaction it got in the studio.
Yeah, so it was like Billy had to make choices about how to present this song. It was like first person plural, we, he's talking about being part of this brotherhood of soldiers. it took him a long time to write the song, like you said, because his buddies they said, please write it for us, be our voice, we're not songwriters. He didn't want to do anything disrespectful, and he didn't want critics saying, wait a minute, you weren't there, and the whole shebang. So when he did write it, he was really meticulous. Things he did were very deliberate. Like if his voice sounded fatigued, that was deliberate. He wanted you to get the feeling of a soldier, a young guy being sent to this jungle. He was very conscious. He didn't want it to be considered, thrown in some category, protest song or whatever. It was a character study. They took a lot of time to put sound effects like crickets or chopper sounds, this kind of thing. They wanted it to sound authentic. And Twyla Tharp had done this musical about Billy Joel songs, and Liberty refrained from saying it because he felt so dedicated. The whole band felt so dedicated to the song. They would bring veterans on to certain performances and have them sing the chorus. They really wanted to tribute the guys because unlike World War II, when the Vietnam vets came back, sometimes they were treated with hostility, they were ignored. It was sort of like saying, these are my buddies. Not everybody had a privileged, not everybody could run off to Canada or this kind of thing. So it was really, he wasn't looking for judgments. He wasn't looking for people to say, it's this, it's that. It was really a song gifted to him by his buddies. He wanted it to be as authentic as possible. It kind of gave me the same goosebumps that I got from a song called The Great Mandala by Peter Yarrow from Peter, Paul and Mary in 1967. This was about a conscientious objector who was starving in prison. So that was more of a different type of theme, but same haunting effect. I can't think of too many other songs in which I literally would have that kind of reaction from hearing a song. And
the build up to the end, you just get goosebumps. When they're all singing, we'll all go down together. I'm surprised it hasn't been featured in movies. I don't know, maybe they've approached Billy about it and he said no, but you think of some of those songs that were used in those films that have become famous, like The End by The Doors, and I'm thinking of there's a few more I'm sure I'm forgetting, but yeah, that would have worked so well in some of those films. Just a powerful song.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good point, Eric, because, there was every once in a while, Billy will talk about his love of classical music, and there's a piece called Adagio for Strings by a composer, Samuel Barber, which was used in Platoon. So you remind me of that. Yeah. It was a gorgeous orchestral piece. That's got me curious. It's possibly that he's very protective because the band members are very protective over that song.
Could very well be. Yeah. Apocalypse Now is the one that had the end in it, I think, right?
Yeah.
Apocalypse Now.
So. And I just want to say also, I just love some of the songs on this album. I mean, Allentown, now Billy Joel is getting into sort of social issues with Allentown. There was a story Liberty talked about, like jumping up and down on an instrument case to get a particular percussive sound. There were times that they would beat the chest of one of the band members to get a different kind of percussive sound. They were looking for all these organic sounds, right?
Very Beatles, Ringo. That's what I think Ringo did that often on the Suitcase.
Yeah. And there was a song called Surprises. Oh my God, he sounds just like Lennon. And somebody brought it up to him. He's like, well, I don't really. I think, again, it's that Billy Joel mimic thing that just comes in so naturally that he had to listen to it before he could really recognize his voice sounding so Lennon-esque. And then there's this beautiful song called Where's the Orchestra that's really could be a Broadway hit. It's about, I compared it to the song Is That All There Is? It's kind of it's beautiful, but it's sort of bleak. It's about disillusionment. And it's really done in the way that a Broadway musical would do. There's a reprise, and Allentown is played instrumentally at the end of it. So it kind of pulls the whole album together.
You make me think now because you're talking about his ability to mimic other singers. I love nowadays when he plays at Madison Square Garden, and he has artists from all different genres coming in. He had Brian Johnson from AC/DC, and there's Billy cranking Back in Black, and he had Joe Elliott from Def Leppard doing Rock of Ages or whatever. It's so cool. Billy loves, you could tell Billy just has an appreciation for so many different styles of music. So he
really does.
He is well-rounded. Let's talk about his ninth studio album, An Innocent Man, which was released on August 8th, 1983. And the album cover shows Billy on the front steps. This is one of your favorites, 142 Mercer Street in Manhattan. 3 top 10 singles, the number 1, Tell Her About It, the number 3, Uptown Girl, and the number 10, An Innocent Man. 4 other singles released, The Longest Time, number 14, Leave a Tender Moment Alone, number 27, Keeping the Faith, number 18, and This Night was a single. Didn't do great, but just the fact that all those singles, again, like I was just saying before, it's like the whole album is all singles. Billy's paying homage to the doo-wop and the soul heroes of his youth, and it's also where he meets his future wife, Christy Brinkley, who's in the video for Uptown Girl. One of the acts Billy was a fan of was Little Anthony and the Imperials. This is such a great story. You talked to Anthony Gourdine, Little Anthony himself. Can you share the story he tells about Billy and how he had Anthony in tears during one of his Madison Square Garden shows?
Well, Billy Joel was completely in awe of Little Anthony and in that period of time. Little Anthony, or Anthony, I don't know if he wants to be still called Little, he didn't particularly like this term doo-wop. He would call it streetlight singing, which might be a more accurate term. So Billy Joel just loved this period of music. Anthony had been a child actor, and he had the most expressive voice. And Billy, I think, also has a very expressive voice, a very warm quality. So I could really see why they would enjoy each other. But Anthony, like Billy Joel, is a very humble person. He was really surprised to know that Billy Joel honored his music to the degree that he did. So Billy Joel invited Anthony to a show at Madison Square Garden. And Anthony was there with George Dassinger, who was his buddy and who worked with him. And Billy Joel said, well, I want the audience to know there's a very special guest in the crowd tonight. And Anthony still didn't know that it had anything to do with him. So his colleague kind of poked him and like, hey, this is about you. And he was so overwhelmed with emotion. I was very touched by that story. And Billy Joel did dedicate a song to Anthony. And this song was a co-write by the great Ludwig van Beethoven.
That's right. That's the track This Night from An Innocent Man.
Part of the song was part of Ludwig's repertoire.
That's cool.
If Ludwig came back to life, maybe they'd have a squabble about that. I don't know. But,
yeah. The Greatest Hits Volume 1 and 2 that Billy put out in 1985, that's a double cassette that I listened to every single day in the summer of 1989. That's when I became a Billy fan. I was mopping floors and waxing floors, the elementary school, summer job. Miserable job, just like 100 degrees. Here's an example of just how great Billy Joel is. So you've got a double best of, packed with hits. And then he just, I'll throw a few new songs on there. And those are hits. Those become future hits. You're Only Human, Second Wind. I think that was top 10, I want to say. Number 9 on Billboard. And then the other one was The Night Is Still Young, which I absolutely love, and that was like top 40. I mean, the guy, it's just amazing. That was like Tom Petty when he had his best of, and let's just put Mary Jane's Last Dance in there, and that's like another huge hit, It's just insane. But yeah, that came out in 85, and then he follows with The Bridge in July of 1986. This is the last one produced by Phil Ramone, who worked with Billy for a decade, and obviously, as we talked about, had a great working relationship with him. The Bridge reached number 10 on the charts. A Matter of Trust, a number 10 single. Love that song. Modern Woman, also number 10. One of my all-time favorite Billy songs, This Is the Time, which peaked at number 18. And Baby Grand, which reached number 75 on the Hot 100, but a number 3 single on the adult contemporary chart. And this is a duet with the late, great Ray Charles. Can you talk about how those two guys met and the creation of that song?
Billy was kind of nervous about the whole thing because he just absolutely adored Ray Charles. He was so inspired. If you look at there was a show called The Old Grey Whistle Test on BBC. The name changed also, but if you look at some of those early episodes, Billy Joel is looking cool. He's wearing shades. He's smoking a cigarette in one hand. He sounds like Ray Charles. You just know that he loves the phrasing of Ray Charles. And so this is high stakes for him. And Billy and Christy had named their daughter Alexa Ray after Ray Charles. I think this appealed to some of Ray Charles's ego when he found out that Billy Joel had named his daughter after him. So Billy decides he's going to write this song, present it to Ray. He's a little nervous about it. He's pacing up and down in this warehouse. He's like trying to finish the song. And, we may think it has not been an issue. Melodies have always come easy for him, but sometimes he struggled with lyrics, just getting it right. It wasn't always easy for him. And so this song, it turns out to be sort of a love song, a romantic song, but at the same time, a love song to the piano, which is what he and Ray Charles, of course, shared. And so his team contacted Ray Charles, and they got together with Billy Joel still sweating things out. And it turned out to be very successful. It turned out to be a very successful collaboration. They both participated in the song. Their phrasing in some ways is so similar that sometimes I really have to listen to it a few times and say, wait a minute, who's singing what?
Yeah, kind of spooky, right?
Yeah. So they sounded just really comfortable singing the song. I think they really owned it. And I think at the end of the day, they were very proud of this song. It's really a beauty. It's a really beautiful ballad.
Absolutely. It would be 3 years before we get the next Billy Joel album, October 17th, 1989. He released studio album number 11, Stormfront. It would be his third number one album, and the song We Didn't Start the Fire, his third number one single. This is also including Leningrad, the top 10 I Go to Extremes, the Downeaster Alexa, number 57, That's Not Her Style, number 77, and the top 40 And So It Goes, along with Shameless, which you mentioned earlier. Mick Jones of Foreigner co-produced the album with Billy. As for We Didn't Start the Fire, this all starts with a comment from a 21-year-old friend of Sean Lennon. What a story.
Sean Lennon and his buddy are playing to Billy Joel. Well, you guys and the baby boomers, you just don't know. You never got stressed out. You didn't have any problems. We have all the problems, dude. And Billy's like, well, wait a minute. And as I've said before, Billy's a voracious reader, sort of a closet history teacher. So he takes it upon himself to chronicle 118 events between his birth year, which is 1949, and 1989. And by the way, 1989 was a big year. That was around the time they did their tour in Russia, which is another colossal undertaking. But he wanted to prove to the younger generation, we've survived a lot of heavy stuff, guys. So this song is loaded with references to iconic political leaders and celebrities and wars and catastrophes and so many things of that nature. Now, Billy did not think much of it musically. He was sort of embarrassed by it. He did some master classes in Long Island. And there's this one shot of Billy kind of banging mindlessly on a note on the piano when he's saying, I didn't do much for this melody. I'm kind of embarrassed by the whole thing. But history teachers have been using this to get their kids really interested in history. I mean, they just tick through these events, and it's just, hey, guys, here's your summer homework assignment. Figure out, what was the Korean War, or who was Nikita Khrushchev, or, how did all these things come together, and how did people survive all these situations?
How did he come up with you said, was it 118 events?
Yeah, he had reference books. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact, but he had a series of reference books, and he would chronologically put together things that were alphabetized and it's not an easy song to sing,
No.
It's like a rap song, really, isn't it?
Yeah. He's just rolling through the names and the events. Did he ever update them as he played the song in future years? He could have added a whole nother verse as the years went along.
Yeah, he really could have. He could have thrown Donald Trump and
a
whole bunch of stuff. But I'm guessing that he has said that his songs are like his children. He's not going to mess with that kid. Once it's born out in the world, he's like, well, okay, guys, that's what I did. But the history teachers are free to do whatever the heck they want.
You put that stuff to music, kids learn it, boom, so much easier, because that's what music can do. It gets into your brain, it gets into your brain, your heart, and your soul, right? So, although nobody knew it, Billy Joel would release his final studio album, River of Dreams, August 10th, 1993. And the cover illustration, like you said, it's done by Christy Brinkley. The title track reached number 3. It also includes the top 20, No Man's Land, the top 30, All About Soul, and Lullaby, Goodnight, My Angel. I love that one. That was top 100, hit number 77, number 18 on the adult contemporary chart as well. You spoke to Joe Nicolo, who was one of the producers of that album. Can you share some of what he told you about the process?
Well, Joe and his brother Phil, they've been termed the Butcher Brothers. Joe started way back when engineers were splicing tapes with blades. I mean, he's just been through all these advances in technology. He lives in Philadelphia. He had his own record label. He has worked with Lauryn Hill and Cyndi Lauper, James Taylor, The Police, The Stones. He's been a Grammy Award nomination for River of Dreams. And I think he was really keenly aware Billy Joel is a full spectrum artist. You know, from what I gathered from the discussions we had, they didn't get past their line in the sand. In other words, Billy Joel had a lot of trust. And so Billy would just say, hey, you know, you deal with the mics. You don't have to consult me about that. You deal with the technology. And you know, they had their, you know, Billy Joel, you're the songwriter. If anything, perhaps there was, I think Joe had wondered, well, okay, when you've got a pianist and a singer, you know, maybe he might have thought, should I isolate that? But people who've worked with Billy pretty much have said, no, if he's going to play and sing, he's going to play and sing. And as technicians, we'll deal with that. It was really a matter of trust because Billy Joel gave Joe carte blanche in terms of vocal and keyboard equipment and practices. Joe did talk to me about some of the things in his toolkit, about using things like a limiter to bring out an artist's high and lows and their dynamics. And there must have been a lot of trust and goodwill because the relationship continued with the greatest hits collection and the complete hits collection. I mentioned Peter Asher when we talked about Linda Ronstadt. Peter Asher was part of a group called Peter and Gordon, and he also managed James Taylor. So in the hits collections, Billy worked with Peter Asher, Joe, the three of them worked together. And I think they just came up with all these good years, you can only go up. It can only be a win-win situation.
And Billy would say in interviews that he wanted to concentrate on writing more instrumental music, and he meant it. Mm-hmm. Fans went as far as to set up a petition to get him to record one more pop rock album, but he didn't. He hasn't. Where do you stand on this? Would you have wanted more from Billy, or are you happy with River of Dreams being his final quote-unquote pop rock album?
I'm truly happy for Billy Joel. I would not have signed that petition. I think that if you look at music history, if you look at recording history, the labels would just run these artists into the ground. They'd be touring and then, okay, guys, we need 10 to 12 songs while you're touring, when you have no free time, when you're exhausted, when your vocals are extended beyond reality. And I really feel like he gave us so much. I mean, if we go to the Garden now, like so many hits. We don't really need him to painstakingly write more. And like I've said, you know, lyrics didn't always come easy. He had melodies, and because he had these melodies, it made complete sense for him to want to work with the melodies and not have that pressure of working on lyrics and storylines and the whole kit and caboodle. So I really think I was appreciative that Billy was very transparent with his fans. You know, you hear of these acts that are like, here's our final concert, and it's not anywhere near their final concert. He didn't lead us on. He didn't say, hey, guys, I'm doing this or that. He said, look, I might do a song here or there, but I'm not going to sit down and do studio albums. I want to kind of get back to my melodic thing and really work on that. He
isn't the guy that's going to go on his farewell tour and then come back 3 years later and say, no, this is my farewell tour, and then come back 5 years later. No, this is my farewell tour. But no, he's cool to the fans in the sense that he's going out there and he's playing. He continues to go out, and he's got a great setup where they pick him up in a helicopter from his home in Long Island, take him to Madison Square Garden, drop him down, plays a show. His fans love him. He loves his fans. He plays a ton of hits, has, like I said, some friends drop by for some special guest appearance, and then he goes back home because he went through some rough times. He had his struggles with alcohol, and he just seemed like he worked so hard during that time. He earned that right to be able to do what he wants, but at the same time, again, he's going out there playing in Madison Square Garden, not just because he loves it, but I think he's also saying, look, I love you guys. I'm not inspired to write any more music for you, but I'm certainly going to go out there and let's share the music together. So it's been a great run. And I remember Rolling Stone had a list of all the songs that he's played. They tallied up all the shows he's played at Madison Square Garden, all the songs he's played, and by album and everything, and it was just this staggering number. And the attendances, I mean, I think he sells out every time he plays. He plays like once a month, doesn't he?
Yeah. I believe he's the only one who's had that kind of a residency. I think they have a plaque commemorating him. And I think the thing is, I went to see him in November, and talk about Billy Joel being sort of a humble person. He looks up at the big screen, with his bald head. He's got a rubbing his scalp, and he's like, I'm supposed to be a rock star. I mean, he never intended to be this rock star guy. He wanted to be a songwriter, but he had to promote his music. But he's really quite transparent about who he thinks he is.
He's this brilliant songwriter who's one of us. It's like you want to go up and give him a big hug, It's like he would, and he would love it too. He's just a regular dude. But he did release one more album, but he stayed true to his promise. Fantasies and Delusions, Music for Solo Piano. That's a collection of classical compositions, no lyrics, and it features British Korean pianist Richard Hyung-ki Joo. He's performing Billy's compositions, but it's interesting. Billy's not performing. He's not playing piano on this. And there was a reason for that, right? Because he didn't have the nuances that he felt were good enough to perform the songs he composed. So he wanted somebody to do it for him, right?
Well, not that I'm an expert at all, but I did take a few years of classical piano, and I was surprised to see to what degree, as a piano student, you are supposed to respect that composer. Is much different than rock. I mean, the pedal markings and the dynamic markings and the way you lift your fingers off. Right. You're judged on every nuance of how you play as a classical pianist. And I think that it was a really wise choice for him to have a luxury of writing, composing, being like one of these great composers, and to not have the burden of creating and being the technician. Yeah. So I totally stand by his concept of hiring a very fine classical pianist who could work on those nuances. He could sit back and listen and maybe say, well, this is what I meant. Maybe I didn't write it in the piece of music, but this is how I wanted it to be translated. So I think that was a really good decision. I
didn't listen to it until I read your book and decided to give it a listen, and it's beautiful. I mean, you have to be in the right mood, in the right place, sit down, have a glass of wine, chill out a little bit. But it's not. If you think it's Billy Joel, writing We Didn't Start the Fire, you're not going to get that. This is a whole different side of him.
It is a whole different side. And there were some beautiful backstories. I mean, like one of the pieces was written when he was sharing custody with his daughter, Alexa, his oldest daughter, and when she was a little girl, and she was going off to leave him for the day. And he was a really good dad. I think it was hard for him to be a divorced dad. And so he wrote this beautiful piece in commemoration of a little bit of that feeling of loss. So, there was a lot of heart behind each of the tunes. Some of the tunes were very, very short. And again, like I said earlier about some of his other instrumental pieces, I'm like, a little more would have been nice, Billy, but who am I to say?
Billy Joel, Every Album, Every Song. It's out now through burningshed.com in the UK and Amazon in the US. Anything else you want to add, Lisa?
Just everybody go and hear Billy Joel. Keep his music alive. Tell the kids, the grandkids, watch TikTok, and just and I think he's a George Gershwin. He didn't have the Ira Gershwin and he didn't have the Bernie Taupins, and he didn't have the John Lennons. It was I consider Billy Joel like that black dress I have in my closet. I can wear stilettos, or I can and pearls, or I can wear a pair of sneakers, but I really love my black dress, and he's a full spectrum artist. He's produced very richly, and sometimes, and other times not. But his songs really stand out, and I think they always will.
Lisa Torem, thank you for being on the podcast.
I thank you so much. I thank you so much for giving writers a platform. Really appreciate that, Eric.
As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.